with some of the others, but we are very excited to have folks in Canada as well that are part of our exchange. Our real focus is on the Northeast's unique ecological issues and the challenges of managing fire and trying to promote fire science across this landscape. As you can see on this map, and as you're probably familiar, we have a pretty significant urban population throughout our range, and especially close to where fire has naturally occurred. So these are some of the challenges that make it really important to have information exchange around fire science in our region. When we did our sensing assessment, these are some of the themes that really popped up in our interviews with folks that work in fire in our region. You know, fire, information, people, science, management, research, working. This is a lot of what we're about, trying to connect the dots between all of these pieces. What our goals are primarily is we want to catalyze collaboration between scientists and land managers. A chief reason why we exist is to communicate. We want to facilitate the flow of information on science and management. We also want to determine innovative solutions to help affect this landscape. And where we can, we try to synthesize existing research and adapt science for applicability in the North Atlantic. How do we do that? Well, a lot of what we've been charged with is these communications efforts. So we have research briefs, we have newsletters, we have webinars such as this one. We have a great website, firesciencenorthatlantic.org. We have a research database. We offer field trips, like one that we had just this week in New Jersey. And we offer capstone workshops, like one that we're preparing for this November in New Jersey. Our leadership team, this is us. I'm the person in the purple shirt. Inga is at the far right, and Erin is in the orange shirt. She's on maternity leave at the moment, but we're excited that we're going to get her back in action pretty soon. And Nick is the guy in the picture. We're really lucky to have Nick leading our team and keeping us moving on things. We also are very lucky to have a great set of community representatives. This is a pretty stacked list. We have great folks that cover a range of agencies and organizations from across our region. And this information is available on our website as well. As in summary, this is a picture from one of our sensing assessments in Massachusetts. Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. So small, proud, mighty, the newest fire science exchange. We're very excited to be who we are and to be able to offer what we can to all of you who are working on fire science in the North Atlantic region. So with that, I want to take a moment. For folks who are on the line, you'll notice that there is a chat box. So in the chat box, if you don't mind, please type and just hit enter. Type your name and your agency or organization. Hopefully everybody can see in the chat box. Don't be shy. Aha. Great. So Green Mountain College. I can't even keep up with everybody. Yeah, this is great. So we have a range of folks on the line. Excellent. Great. So we have a range of academics and practitioners and folks with government and folks with other organizations as well. Excellent. So the chat box is there for you to pose questions. I'm going to turn the floor over shortly to Dr. Jennifer Marlin to begin the meat of the webinar. But if you have a question, then please type it into the chat box. And when the webinar concludes, then I'll help moderate going through those questions in the chat box. So let me get up Jenn's bio because it's a pretty extensive one. Here we go. Sorry, just a moment. Okay. Dr. Jennifer Marlin is an associate research scientist at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She studies long-term environmental change, particularly relating to climate change and wildfires. She began her studies in the Pacific Northwest and subsequently developed a global charcoal database that houses hundreds of sediment records from lakes, soils, and oceans. She has used this unique data set to reconstruct recent fire history in the western U.S. and the fire history of Earth during the past 20,000 years. so she's got a lot to do. After completing her PhD, Dr. Marlin was awarded an NSF Earth Sciences postdoctoral fellowship to examine the coupled response of fire and vegetation to climate changes since last glaciation. Results from her research have been published in journals such as Nature Geoscience, Nature Climate Change, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and Forest Ecology and Management. She is currently involved in 2 large collaborative efforts, PaleoFire and a global fire data comparison initiative, both designed to bridge paleo data and modern observations in order to improve Earth system and ecosystem model projections. Dr. Marlin is currently expanding her paleo research towards the social sciences as part of the Yale project on climate change communication, where she studies public understanding of and responses to climate change and weather hazards, including hurricanes and heat waves. These interests stem largely from her long-term role as a co-organizer of a science education and training program called the Dissertation Initiative for the Advancement of Climate Change Research. The goal of this group is to establish connections among researchers focusing on the scientific and human dimensions of climate change, and to make it easier for new scholars to work in a more interdisciplinary and socially relevant context. Dr. Marlin holds a PhD and MS in geography both from the University of Oregon and a BS from the University at Albany State University of New York. Jenn, it's great to have you. Thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing your webinar. I'm about to hand you the floor, and we will get started.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you to you and Inga and the rest of the team for setting these up. I am completely thrilled to be giving this webinar, and thank you everybody for taking some time here before lunch to join me. As Amanda said, my background in fire largely comes from the West, and so I'm going to take a little bit of time here and talk to you about 2 studies, one from the West and one from the East. So you'll have to bear with me while we go through the fire in the Western U.S. a little bit. But I think the reason I'm doing it is because I think there are some interesting lessons there and interesting comparisons to draw. I also just want to acknowledge NSF and Pages and the Global PaleoFire Working Group before I get started for funding the research that I do. So let's see. To advance a slide, Amanda, remind me.
Yep, there's the right arrow to the right of the name of the slide.
Okay, got it. Okay.
There we go.
All right. So this looks a little bit weird here. Okay, so Amanda also mentioned the Global Charcoal Database. So as a dissertation project, basically, I decided it would be a good idea to pull together all of the PaleoFire records that I could find in the literature, because at that time, many people were developing these long, interesting fire and vegetation histories from particular sites in different places, but there wasn't a whole lot of comparison going on. And because of my interest in climate change, I was particularly interested to see if we could combine data from many different locations and start getting regional, even continental, and potentially even global scale sort of summaries of how fire has changed on Earth to inform climate change modeling, basically, and look at fire emissions and things like that. So throughout my career so far, I've really been acting as a bridge between field-based paleoecologists and other disciplines like atmospheric chemists and ecosystem modelers or global climate modelers, and trying to bring paleo data to other audiences. And now, is working in collaboration with the Global PaleoFire Working Group, which is about over 100 people now who've contributed these records. We're really trying to go back down to local scales and help make these data of use to managers. So that's why I've been looking forward to this call and to learning more about the exchange, and hopefully having some conversations in the future with some of you on the line here about how you might use paleo data. So as I go through this, if nothing else, I hope you will gain a little familiarity with the kind of data in this global charcoal database, because we have a new website coming up called PaleoFire.org. It's going to allow some interactivity and easy access to the data. This started with just a few dozen records that I put in this global database, and now we're working on we're about to publish version 3. We're working on version which is going to have over 1,200 records with pretty good representation in North America in particular, and along the West Coast and in the Northeast quite a bit as well. Although some of the Northeastern data, I'm going to talk to you today about records from the Cape Cod area, mostly developed at Harvard Forest, but there are a lot of data coming in from the Northeast, which is really exciting, and it's going to be available in version 4. So most of these PaleoFire records are from forests, but we do have an increasing number from grasslands and woodland environments. The colored dots, don't worry about the colors too much here. It's just showing you what version the data come from. So I also wanted to mention this project, the Paleon project. This is funded by NSF, and it's an effort that I'm working with and is helping me focus on the Northeast. It's bringing together 3 groups of people, field ecologists, like data collectors basically, with ecosystem modelers and statisticians. And the idea is that we're trying to help the modeling community understand the importance of fire and that they need to include it in their models of ecosystem change, even in the East, and also that we need more information about long-term slow processes of vegetation change. And those need to be built into the models as well if we want to be confident about their predictions or projections. Because right now, modelers tend to assume sort of a steady state, as if the forest didn't change and the fire regime didn't change prior to settlement. And of course, if paleo data tell us anything, it's that forests are really dynamic and fire regimes are really dynamic. And so they need us to kind of get our measurements in good enough shape, centralized, standardized, with quantified uncertainties so that they can incorporate them into the models and help improve the projections. So that's what that network and that project is about. So let me tell you a little bit about how PaleoFire records are created or formed. And basically, lakes act as natural archives, and so do bogs and swamps and any kind of environment that remains wet continuously through time. So charcoal and pollen and a lot of other things blow and wash into the lakes and accumulate in this kind of layer cake of mud, if you will, through time, kind of like an ice core. And you can see this beautiful example in the top right photo. Let's see if I can get my arrow going here, of a sediment record from Foy Lake. This is Montana, and this is a freeze core taken in the winter, and it shows annual layering. Actually, each one of those bands is an annual layer called a varve. So this is a varve sediment record. Down below here is a sediment record that probably has decadal resolution or so. This white band is a volcanic ash layer, which in the west is handy because you can use it to help date your sediments. So as fires occur on the landscape around your lake, the charcoal is incorporated into the lake and can be used to reconstruct changes in the abundance of charcoal over time, and that gives us a sense of basically just how much burning there was. We can't reconstruct area burned. We don't know where the charcoal came from. We don't know whether people started the fire or lightning started the fire, but we do know whether there was a lot of charcoal or a little charcoal. And so we're basically just reconstructing relative changes in charcoal abundance. I'm going to refer to those patterns as changes in biomass burning because we know that at least is what it is. Sometimes I'll say fire activity is sort of a generic term because we don't know exactly, but we don't have the spatial precision or the temporal precision that fire scar records have, for example. So we have kind of a fuzzy record of fire, but the advantage is that it goes back thousands of years. Some of the marine sediment cores we have go back hundreds of thousands of years. Most of the lake cores go maybe 5, 10, 15,000 years back in time. And they don't degrade as you go back in time. So this is my friend and coring buddy, Megan Walsh, out in the Pacific Northwest near Mount Rainier, just to give you a sense of what the equipment looks like. And how the cores are just sunk into the lake sediments, and then we extract the cores and take them back to the lab and sample them. Now, on the left, you're looking at an age depth model, and on the right are just some examples of the charcoal. So we basically send a few samples from a sediment core off to a lab for radiocarbon dating. Typically, we have, let's see, there's the arrow. That's a radiocarbon date. And we construct, just using regression, we get an age depth model to estimate ages for each centimeter of the core, or for each sample in the core that we take. Nowadays, most people are sampling fairly big charcoal particles. We call them macroscopic, greater than 100 microns or so. People used to quantify microscopic charcoal much more, but by looking at the larger particles, you just sieve the mud basically. You can sample a core every centimeter and typically get decadal scale reconstructions of fire activity using that. Whereas when people look at microscopic charcoal, you're typically sampling a sediment core maybe only 5 or every 10 centimeters because it's more labor intensive, and so you get a lower resolution record. But I'll show you in a minute, the trends are typically the same, or often the same, whether you use macro or micro, but you get higher resolution records with macro. So mostly what I'm talking about when I show you these studies are macroscopic charcoal records. Here you can see there's woody charcoal on top and herbaceous on the bottom. And so that can be distinguished, which is really handy because it gives you a sense of how the fuel is changing over time that's burning. A lot of people don't do that now, but increasingly it's becoming common, and I like to encourage that because if we had more of that data, it'd be really, really handy. So this slide I just wanted to point out because I know some people are familiar with microscopic charcoal records. And if you see the trends in the microscopic charcoal data here, this is a record from Massachusetts covering the past 2,500 years, and it's showing you that microscopic and macroscopic generally have similar patterns. There's low burning here and here, there's higher burning here and here, for example, and so often the trends are quite similar. So this is an example pollen diagram. I'll just quickly walk you through in case anybody's not familiar with these. This is from Battleground Lake in Washington State, which is surrounded by Doug fir forest with some hemlock and cedar. It's a small undisturbed lake. This is a record spanning 14,000 years. And here on the left are the raw charcoal data. And what we can do is we can smooth this. I wonder if I can move this arrow. I guess I can't. Okay. I can't move it continuously like a laser pointer. Anyway, so this is the raw charcoal data. To the right are basically peaks above the background level, which are inferred fire events or episodes, because if there were a few fires that occurred in a single summer or within 10 years even, we can't tell them apart, so we call them fire episodes instead of fire events. But you do get a sense as to how the number of events per 1,000 years, say, have varied over time. And in this particular record, you can see that there was a few fire events and then more fire events, and then it declines a bit in the late Holocene. Fire magnitude is the next series over. You can see a large fire at the top of the record there. That's actually a logging fire that's in the historical record near this lake. But what's cool is that the herbaceous charcoal that was separated out here really increases during the middle Holocene here from about 11 to 6,000 years ago. And if we continue over and look at the vegetation changes, we can see that the vegetation shifted from an open pine parkland in the early Holocene to more of an oak savanna in the middle Holocene, and that's when we get the high herbaceous charcoal. And then in the late Holocene, we get this Doug fir forest, and the oak savanna is basically gone or largely reduced. And so we know if we look at paleoclimate data, we can understand why that happened and why we had more grass fires and grassland burning, in particular in the Middle Holocene. This is kind of a funny graph here. We call it the flying carpet. So 25,000 years ago is here, and modern day is here. And basically, when we had high burning in the Middle Holocene about 10,000 years ago, you can see that incoming solar radiation was really high in, if you follow the line down, the summer months, June, July, and August. So 10,000 years ago, due to changes in the Earth's orbit and the amount of incoming solar radiation, we actually had warmer summers and drier summers. Winters were cooler than they are today. So today, this is sort of the average of today. So the seasonality several thousand years ago of our climate was much more intensified in the Middle Holocene. And so that created the expansion of oak savanna in the Pacific Northwest and more burning at that time. And since then, the forests have gotten wetter and cooler and more mesic. And so what I love about paleo data is that it really shows us that there are these very strong climatic controls of vegetation and often disturbance regimes that go along with them that are happening on really slow time scales, but nonetheless they're important forces that are playing out as sort of these background level changes. And often compared to human activities and the impacts of people recently, we feel like those slow climate processes are completely swamped, but they're actually not. They're often working as sort of like the baseline upon which all these other changes are happening. Okay, so moving into the western U.S., this is a pretty cool data set put together by Pat Bartlein and built on Westerling and the Forest Service data. Pat Bartlein here has just converted it into a neat visual form. And what we see is that on the left panel, we have lightning-started fires. On the right, the human-started fires. This is a composite of fires in the West during a 10-year period, 1986 to 1996. And you can immediately see the impact of some of the big controls on fire in the West, the first of which is the distribution of fuels on the landscape. So you've got the basin and range here and large areas of desert where you just don't have enough fuels. You've got the Columbia Plateau up to the north where there isn't much fire. And you can see that fire is only happening where there is enough fuel, basically. You can also see the impact of people all along the coast and even in the wet forests up here in the Pacific Northwest, where you don't get many lightning-started fires. And I think of this as a bit more analogous to the East, right, where almost all of our if we had this data for the East, and we don't have data nearly as comprehensive as for the East, but if we did have it, it would be almost all human-started fires with a smattering. We do have lightning-started fires here, but much less than the human-started fires, of course. So if you look at those data distributed throughout the year, you can see this kind of pops out. We know that everybody likes to set fires on the 4th of July, or that a lot of accidental fires happen on the 4th of July. But what you can see is a strong climate influence on fire here, because whether it's lightning caused or human caused, the distribution is basically the same. It peaks in the summer months, although people definitely spread out the distribution of fires in the West, and because we like fires in the winter months as well. But mostly the fuels are dry enough in the summer, and so that's when the fires happen. So now I want to go back a bit further in time. That data set was from the last couple of decades, but we do have a record from a USDA report here that goes back 300 plus years, and this is a really interesting data set because it documents the deforestation of the country, basically, with European settlement. And so up here in the top is 1630 estimates of the original saw timber, and so what they mean there is estimated trees that were at least 50 years old. And you can see the east, this should all be sort of a solid color here. This is basically covered with saw timber, and there were large islands of it, of course, in the west in 1630. They did another map here in 1850. You can see a lot of deforestation starting in the east. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, youngest trees remaining now are 270 years old, whereas they were 50 years old in the top panel, and down in the bottom panel, you can see it's all pretty much gone. Youngest trees 350 years old, and we just have some little islands left in the west. So I was interested because in addition to documenting, to creating estimates, every decade they basically made estimates for the last few hundred years in this report. And so I was interested because they also estimated how much of this saw timber was lost due to various things like insects and disease, but also to fires. And so I was pretty excited about that. The estimates are undoubtedly crude, but nonetheless they did as much ground truthing as they could, and they seemed to be informed estimates anyway. And this was made for the whole country, east and west, and the shape is basically the same, although of course the losses occurred earlier in the east. And for fire, you can see that the human-caused fires really start increasing in the 1800s and peak in the late 1800s and then die off after the 1900s. And this curve here was not from that original report. This is for a newer study that documented stand origins and showed that there was, of course, many stand origin dates happened after the peak in forest destruction, as they called it. So what I wanted to do was look at the available fire data and try to overlap it with this historical report to see if we could see that signal in the paleo data and in the fire scar data. So pulled together 69 lake records, everything I could find, along with several hundred tree ring records. The trees are in green triangles, and the lakes are the blue and purple dots. And purple just means it's a higher resolution record where we could get fire frequency from those peaks in addition to sort of the background trends in biomass burning. And so I thought these signals, if I combine the data from the lakes and the data from the trees, the signals would be quite different because the lakes are in ormesic forests and mixed conifer, some high elevation sites and subalpine fir, whereas the dendro sites are really all from dry ponderosa pine forest, much drier forest in general. So I honestly didn't know what we were going to get. So this is, oh boy, this graphic is not showing up. That's too bad. Okay, so you're only seeing the beginning of this graphic from 1,000 to maybe 16, or yeah, okay. So if you saw this whole graph, you would see lots of red tick marks, and you would see each tick mark is basically a fire, a reconstructed fire from fire scar chronologies throughout the West. And what you would see is that there are a lot of tick marks in the far north and the far south. There's a missing band in the middle where there isn't enough fuel, basically. But what you would see is a really strong drop-off in fires in the past 100 years. So you see lots of burning, basically, and then almost nothing in the last century or so. It's just a gray stripe. The red stripes turn into gray stripes. You also can see things like this, which is a vertical sort of stripe where you get regional fires, and those pop out increasingly in the 1800s in particular. Let's see if these show. Okay, so this is a time series of all of those data. So if you compress all of those data and look at the proportion of dendrocytes that are recording fire scars, this is the temporal trend that you get. And basically only considering the data reliable after 1500 or so, because there's just not enough sites before then. But basically you see this hump pattern, and you'll remember in the USDA report we also saw this hump pattern. It peaks in close to 1800, and then there is a little dip here. This is actually 1814. There was a big volcanic eruption at that point, which I think this is probably why the fires declined at that time. I think it's Tambora was the eruption, and then it increases again, and then you get a giant fire suppression signal, but not just fire suppression. Of course, there was massive grazing, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of heads of cattle in the west at that time, reducing fuels. You also have landscape fragmentation, so lots of fire breaks, and then, of course, big changes in just cultural attitudes towards fire and political climate changing. So that's the fire scar record. What about the charcoal data? The charcoal data, remember, we had 69 lakes, lake records, and this top red wiggly curve is a composite of those 69 lakes, biomass burning for the past 2,000 years. The gray is just a smaller smoothing window with. And then the fire frequency trends. And you can basically see a long-term slight decline in the mean. The overall trend is down a bit, but you see a peak during the medieval climate anomaly when we know there was extensive drought. There's some nice fire scar records from sequoias, for example, in California that match up with this, and we know it was warmer, drier, and lots more fire. Then we see a big decline during the Little Ice Age and also during the time of collapse in many Native American populations across the country. And then we see this hump again. It's peaking at about 1800, a little bit past then, and then again the fire exclusion or fire suppression signal is quite clear. So stacking these up all together and adding some climate data now, we can start to try to understand from sort of a bird's eye view of what's happened in the West over the past few thousand years. We see the forest, the historical data has that peak, the tree ring data have the peak, and the charcoal data all have this peak in burning during the 17 and 1800s, and then the big drop off into the 1900s. We have a reconstruction of temperature here from a globally gridded data set that's based on a variety of different paleoclimate data. And we have tree ring reconstructions of drought here at the bottom. And then we have an estimate of Native American populations and then increasing Europeans, Euro-American settlers here after in the past few hundred years. And so the big message here is that biomass burning, even just looking at this very coarse scale, lumping all these records across, of course, across a great diversity of forests, we get similar signals for the past few hundred years, and we also see fires responding very sensitively to changes in temperature and drought, increasing when it's warmer and drier in general. And what we can do with this data, we took the temperature and the drought records and developed a statistical model to predict biomass burning, this red curve. And that's what this dotted black curve is. I'm going to go to the next slide here. So basically, if you take just the temperature and drought records and you predict biomass burning, you get this purple line. So we can predict changes in biomass burning quite well. You can see an R-squared of 0.85 using only data prior to 1800, and you can also try it prior to 1600. Either way, you get a good result. And then if you take that statistical model and project it forward for the past couple hundred years, you see that the statistical model projects that based on our records of drought and temperature, we should be burning at the levels up here with this purple line. But what we actually observe is very, very low charcoal levels because we've been putting all the fires out, of course. And so I should say these data don't go all the way to the present day, and most of the increases in wildfire in the West have happened in just the last 10, 15 years. So now, of course, this curve has started to come back up. I don't know whether it's here or here. It's probably not up here yet. We know Alaska right now is having a pretty intense wildfire season. And so this sort of area in here, this triangle is, we call in this paper, the fire deficit in the western U.S. It's the gap between what's actually happening and what you'd expect to be happening under sort of natural climatic conditions. And there are many other things going on, of course. There's more fuel buildup from fire suppression and from rising CO2 levels. There's drought-stressed trees. We've got insect outbreaks. We've got more people in the wild and urban interface. And for the most part, many of these factors are actually contributing or promoting more fire and not dampening it. Okay. So I'm going to change gears now and go to the east. So this is a data set, again, compiled by Pat Bartline at the University of Oregon, just merging together existing data sets from the Forest Service and from the Canadian fire databases to try to get a picture of what's going on in North America. And you can see right away that the data have some problems. There's definitely more area burned and more fires in New York than one. So you can see that, and this is part of what I'm interested now is in compiling and standardizing better data sets, historical data sets for New England and for the East, because there are clearly some artifacts. Even over here, you see the state borders. This is not right. Perhaps the line between Canada up here is right to some extent, but there are definitely artifacts from just problems with the data set, differences in reporting, and so on. But nonetheless, we do know that there are fewer fires in the East than in the West. And some of you have compiled some of that data to try to give us a picture of what's going on in this broad way. So from Greg and Mark put together, and I guess Regina Winkler put some information here together for the East that shows the big decline in fire since the early 1900s. And this is a picture that Lloyd Erland shared some data that he's compiled, and again shows the same pattern for Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, the big decline in fire. And so we know that story pretty well. So what can we extend that back in time, and can we figure out what was happening before this peak? Was it a peak, or was it actually at a high level up here and then it declined? Or what can the paleo data tell us basically? So this is now a study that I'm working on with Wyatt Oswald and David Foster and others in Cape Cod. I believe many of you were just there. I actually haven't been here in a couple of decades now, but this is Tim Parshall et al. Started the study looking at 7 sites in Cape Cod and found a really strong impact of geology and substrate. So sandy soils, more pine oak, more burning on the sandy outwash soils, and a little bit less burning farther inland on the moraines where you have more oak forest. And so this study that I was working on is combining some records from beech forest and also from Martha's Vineyard. And the idea is to break it down into sort of beech, oak, and pine groups. And this is a horrible oversimplification, of course. The beech forest is definitely a beech forest, so it's fair to call that. This is from Noshawn Island. There are 3 sites from Noshawn Island. But if you look at Martha's Vineyard, these are some maps from the Nature Conservancy that David Foster shared, and you can see the tremendous complexity in the actual vegetation, but generally oak and pine. At the pine sites, there's generally more pine, and at the oak sites there's generally more oak, although there's also pine at those sites and vice versa. And many of you know these forests way better than I do. But nonetheless, looking through this paleo lens, we can sort of roughly break them into 3 groups. So the top sites here are our beech sites, Blaney's, Duck, and Mary's with the dark green banner. And you can see there's hardly any beech pollen here. Fagus is the beech pollen, but that's because beech don't produce much pollen actually, and the pollen it does produce doesn't travel very far. So even if you have only 12% beech pollen in your sediment core, that means you're in a beach forest. Oak and pine are much more prolific producers, pine in particular. So it takes a little bit of work to interpret these pollen diagrams, but these Deep and Harlock and Icehouse are the oak sites, and then down here, Eagle, Fresh, Round, Duart, and Wildwood are the pine, the lighter green. You can see relatively more pine pollen in these sites. So we wanted to compare charcoal levels in these sites. Now, in the West, charcoal levels are largely controlled by elevation and topography. If you get a big lake in a big watershed with steep slopes and you have enough forest around it, you're going to get a lot of charcoal coming in. In the East, it's completely different. So I wasn't sure how the levels of charcoal would vary. But what we found was that somewhat comfortingly, because this is intuitive with what you would expect, the beech forests have the lowest levels of charcoal in the pre-settlement samples, and the oak have intermediate levels, and the pine had the most charcoal. If we separate out the post-settlement samples, it becomes a bit more muddled. The beech still have the lowest amount, but the oak and pine have switched. So the primary control on the absolute amount of charcoal going into these lakes is based on the forest type. Now, I was interested to see how the level of pollen and the forest response basically is to increasing fire at these different sites. So the beech here, again, you see low levels of beech pollen overall, but if you look as the amount of charcoal increases here, the beech pollen declines. So basically, if you get more fires in a beech forest, you're going to have a decline in the beech trees. And at the oak sites, the relationship is actually different. The oak is actually increasing a little bit in response to more burning, or it's staying the same. One site declines here, but overall the trends are a slight increase or just sort of stable. Whereas the pine sites are responding more like the beech. When we have more fire at the pine sites, we're getting less pine pollen and probably more herbaceous, maybe more oak. So that also is sort of in line with what we understand about oak being fire adapted. The decline in pine, I suppose, I'd be curious to see if this fits what everyone would expect or not, actually. But I think for the oak, at least, this to me makes a lot of sense. So looking at the trends in fire over the past 2,000 years at these sites, they're broken out into the beech sites and the oak and the pine. And basically, you can just see there's a lot of variability in charcoal. And so I wanted to summarize this and look at the trends in a different way. So here I'm fitting just a statistical model, a generalized additive model, to try to understand the variations a little bit better, because those other lines were quite noisy. So if you fit a model to these charcoal samples in the different forest groups, you see a long-term decline in the pine sites and a long-term decline in the oak sites, and not much going on at the beech sites, but we don't have much data from those. So that was interesting. The long-term decline at both the oak and pine sites shifts, and since 500 years ago, it increases at the pine sites and at the oak and the beech as well, and that, of course, is the European settlement signal. But I was interested to see, coincident with the population decline here in Native American populations, at least one, maybe a few of the oak sites really seem to show a drop in charcoal levels. And in contrast, the pine sites are increasing in charcoal at this time. So to me, I'm always interested in trying to find evidence of Native American burning, and I think many other people look to Paleo records for this as well. To me, if there is some evidence for it, it's at the oak sites. Because if the decline here The long-term decline can be explained by temperature and moisture, and I'll show you those data in a minute. But to me, if this decline here was a little ice age signal, for example, driven by climate, then you would expect it to be seen, especially at the pine sites, which we don't see at all. So fire in the pine sites is actually increasing during the little ice age, but it's decreasing at the oak sites. So to me, this could be some evidence of Native American burning, perhaps for acorns. So if we go and look at what available paleoclimate data are here in the area, I've extracted from a global temperature reconstruction the temperature data. This is simulated temperature data from a model and the population estimates. The long-term decline in charcoal here for all 13 of the Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Noshon Island sites show this long-term decline very clearly. I think it's pretty clear that that's related to climate and not to population, which most likely was increasing during this time. But I do think there might be some evidence at the oak sites for a reduction in human-caused burning in Cape Cod, at least. And over here on the left is a map of where we believe people were. This is the distribution of late woodland Indian settlements. This is from Partial and Foster, 2002, attributed to data from Cook, 1976. I don't know where these data came from, but the estimates show, because I actually looked in that book and I couldn't find the data. But the data do show more people living along the coast and along the rivers, which we know to be true. So I think the patterns there at least are good. So I'm also, I'm wrapping up here quickly, but I just wanted to also share that we do have some data on hydroclimate now for the Northeast from Paleo Records. I'm working on a synthesis of paleoclimate data from the Northeast, and we see in tree ring records and in varve thicknesses from lake sediments, we see a wetting trend, a strong wetting trend over the past 1,000 years. So in addition to the cooling trend, we're seeing a wetting trend. And 3 lake level records suggest this wetting trend has been going on for at least 3,000 years. And this is precipitation inferred from pollen. So we have lots of different paleoclimate sources all telling us the same thing. The Northeast is getting wetter. And instrumental data tell us the same thing as well. Not only is it getting wetter here, but increases in very heavy precipitation events. If you live here, you know this. They're increasing by 71%, the heaviest rainfall events. It's getting wetter. And this, of course, has implications for fire and for vegetation as a whole, as well as for people and infrastructure and on and on. So I think we've got some big changes coming, and in fact the paleo data, I meant to point this out, the varved lake and the tree ring data suggest that the wetting trend is actually accelerating right now. So it's been getting wetter, but now it's getting wetter faster. So if we were using fire, if you're using fire to try to create open spaces, maintain them, or for conservation, you're going to need to be using it even more to do the same thing going forward. Of course, we're also in the context of warming temperatures, longer summer seasons, hotter summer days. In the West, this is all leading to more fire because we have dry summers there. Here, of course, our summers are super humid. When we get lightning, it's accompanied by heavy downpours. So if there were, however, droughts in the spring or fall, I could imagine perhaps potential for very large fires in the east, or at least larger than what we'd expect, just because we have more biomass and we're going to have some very hot days. These graphs are just examples from Maine's climate future showing how the trend in temperatures, it's increased 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895 in Maine, and these are some numbers showing how the number of very hot days over 95 degrees is going in Portland from 4, which is what we have in the 2000s, to we're projecting over 13 of those days in the 2050s. It's pretty much the same story for Hertford and places farther south. They're talking about feeling like Georgia and South Carolina up here, which is kind of how it feels the past few days, actually. So that's, I think that's a wrap. Oh, I did just want to add that a new modeling study did come out just the other day, and they don't actually have any projections for the Northeast for increasing fire. They show lots of increases in fire in the West, but there are projections when you get out several decades of increasing fire along the Atlantic coast potentially. So that's interesting. And that is all I have, and I would be happy to take questions. Thanks for listening.
Jenn, thank you so much. That was an incredible overview. For folks listening, if you have questions for Jenn, please type them into the chat box, and we'll address them in order. That was an amazing synopsis of cross-continental data through many thousands of years and still bringing relevance from the west to the east. Thank you. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, again, folks, if you have questions, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. I'm sure folks have questions from the presentation. Aha, here goes. So Diane Burbank is asking, will this PowerPoint be available for us? Yes, that's an easy one. We will make the PowerPoint available online at the firesciencenorthatlantic.org website. Bob?
I was just going to add there is a caveat that there are a couple of in-prep graphs in there that may change. So not peer-reviewed yet, but I'm pretty confident in the data, or I wouldn't have showed them yet.
Yeah, and I should clarify. So we'll have the whole presentation, including the audio portion, available on the website. So we'll have your descriptions of what data we're seeing. All right, so Bob has a question. Will the Martha's Vineyard work have separation of woody versus, let me see, chat box is jumping. Will the Martha's Vineyard work have separation of woody versus herbaceous charcoal over time? Is there a division between C3 and C4 charcoal?
People are starting to do division between C3 and C4 charcoal. Often those are sort of chemists who are getting into this field who are doing that, although some ecologists are doing it as well. There are a few records, none from the Northeast that I know of, although I need to talk to Dave Nelson down south and see if he knows of any. And Martha's Vineyard, most of those records are coming out of the Harvard Forest, who have not traditionally separated woody versus herbaceous charcoal. But again, that's something I absolutely will talk to the folks over there about and see if they have any of that data. They don't, unfortunately, that I know of, but everybody going forward really should collect it because it's really interesting.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Greg Nowacki is asking a question. He says, doesn't the increase in temperature offset the increase in precipitation, i.e. evapotranspiration, effective moisture?
I think it really depends. I think it depends on the seasonality of the changes in particular, and how much temperature is increasing versus how much effective moisture is, or how much precipitation is increasing and when the precipitation is coming. I mean, if it's all coming in heavy events, but the humidity overall throughout the year isn't changing much, then perhaps the temperature would. But I think it really depends on subtle differences in the distribution of precipitation throughout the day, throughout the year, the tails versus the central part of the distribution, issues like that. It's a good question, and I'm not sure we even know. A lot of the paleoclimate data is actually really new. We haven't had this sort of big picture understanding of what's going on in the east. We knew it was getting wetter from the instrumental records, but I don't know. Well, I mean, some of the individual data records have been published, like the lake level trends definitely have been out there suggesting this wetting trend. But what's interesting to me also is that we've had a big reversal in temperature, right? We had long-term cooling, but then we have global warming starting in the past, 100 or a couple hundred years or less, depending on what area you're looking at. But the wetting trend has sort of continued straight away. It hasn't reversed or anything. So I haven't totally digested that yet to see what kind of effect that would have. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, interesting. Let's see, Bob has another question. Are there microlocational biases built into the collection of core sites? For example, could wind direction affect charcoal deposition at the very local level?
Yes, that is definitely true, and this is exactly one of the reasons why I like to combine as many sites as I can to get an understanding of regional pictures, because sometimes you can find sites right next to each other that one will show a long-term upward rise in charcoal, and the other will show the exact opposite. I haven't seen an example of this in the east, but definitely in the west, and that is often because of local, it could be geology, it could be landscape position, but yes, absolutely. And so when you're reconstructing fire history or vegetation history from a single site, you have to be really cautious about making generalizations. When I start getting, 5 or 6 records from a small area, or 10 or 12, then you really can start picking out, well, okay, what are all the sites experiencing? And so you're just looking at averages then and shared patterns, basically.
Great. Let's see, if other folks have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. We've just got a few minutes before noon, so we have time for a few more questions. Here goes another question. Inga is asking, was the pine gain during the Little Ice Age due to a change in fire or lack of human population in the Northeast?
So that's an interesting question. There isn't a way to tell. So if you're saying a lack of a human population, you're getting more fire because people were basically preventing fires before then? If you see the decline in fire in the oak forest when populations declined, but an increase in fire in the pine sites when populations declined. I'm not sure. I don't know. I guess that's an open question. Oh, I did want to mention that there is a new study out. It's by a Polish scientist, and it's not in a very big journal, but it looks at bacteroides, which is a bacteria from human guts, basically, and he's using it as an indicator of human presence around the lake. And to me, this is like the holy grail. Like if we could see whether people were really around a lake by looking at the sediments, it would answer thousands and thousands of questions, because right now the only time we can infer that is when we have a really good archaeological record and there are artifacts, or some site right near the lake, so we know when people were there or weren't there. But if we could actually detect that from the lake sediments themselves, that could change everything for paleoscience, and it could answer exactly that question that you're asking, Inga.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to more work on that to see how hard it is to use in a wider manner.
Yeah. All right, we have another minute or so for questions, and folks are welcome to stay on the line longer if you have other questions. But meanwhile, feel free to type them into the chat box. While we're waiting for folks to enter questions, Jen, I'll just mention that back in March, we had a field trip to Cape Cod, and we were hosted very graciously by the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. And their natural resources director said, yes, we have a long history of fire and use of fire to manage our landscape here on the Cape. So I could share a little bit more information about that. But yes, we definitely have other additional evidence of native use of fire in that region.
Right, yes. And I didn't mean to discount that. I guess when I'm talking about thousands of years ago. There are definitely tons of historical and ethnographic and other accounts of burning, for sure.
Yeah, I just sort of adding on to that. This is really impressive. So it's noon right now. Again, Jen, thank you so much for wrapping up with this amazing data set from all across the country, from so many different types of data, and showing how they relate to climate and human interactions. If folks have questions, you're welcome to we'll keep the chat box window open for a while, and feel free to type in a question. But in the meantime, anyone who has to go, thank you for joining us. And we'll make this presentation available online on the firesciencenorthatlantic.org website. So Jen, thank you very, very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
This was great.
Great.
Yay.
Thanks.
You're getting a bunch of thank yous in the chat box.
Thanks. for listening. I see hi to Bill Patterson out there. I see his name.
Yay. And Jen, if folks have questions, are you okay with us sharing your contact info?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead and email me. I'd be happy to learn more, share data, share thoughts, and so on. Feel free to email me.
Great. Yeah. So we can send out, or we can post your contact info with the presentation once we get it online.
Great. Yeah. Sounds good.
All right. Well, it's been a couple minutes. I'm not seeing new questions coming into the chat box. There's a bunch of people, so I'm a little wary of unmuting the phone lines. But I think if you have a question, feel free to type it in. We'll stay on for another minute or so. And if folks don't have questions or you think of a question later, then you can contact Dr. Marlin via email later on. Bob is asking, who is the other voice? Is that Amanda? Yes, I'm the person that says I'm Xander Evans, who's our research director at the Forest Guild, but this is Amanda Mahaffey. All right. Okay. Well, I think with that we can wrap up the webinar. Again, thanks to everybody so much for participating. Jen, thank you. This was an outstanding webinar. Really, really appreciate your taking the time to share your expertise.
My pleasure. All right.
All right.
Have a good
Thank
day.
you.
All right.
Yeah. Take care.